the Rolex Learning Center built in Switzerland by Kazuyo Sejima and Yuie Nishizawa. We are on the shore of Lake Léman facing the Alps, a few kilometers from Lausanne. Standing on the bank of the lake is a wave of concrete and glass that, since being built in 2010, has inspired a number of metaphors. Some see it as a slice of Emmental cheese, others as a molecular fabric, others still as a moth-eaten flying carpet. It is true that the building resembles nothing known, and that its shape makes it difficult to guess what may go on inside. In fact, it is what is known as a learning centre, a new concept meaning a space dedicated to knowledge. The Federal Polytechnic School of Lausanne has nearly 8,000 students and researchers from all over the world. After constant mutation for over a century, the site is particularly dense and disparate. It is easy to get lost among the anarchically placed back-to-back buildings. There is no centre of gravity, no gathering place for the students. In a word, no social life. The neurosciences, nuclear physics, robotics, civil engineering and architecture are all taught in compartmentalised departments. In 2004, the management of the school decided to create a learning platform that would remove the physical barriers between people and disciplines. The objective was to create a rallying point at the heart of the campus to contain both a temple of knowledge and a large public space. Following a competition that included some of the great names in architecture, amongst whom were Rem Koolhaas, Zaha Hadid and Jean Nouvel, the jury unanimously selected the most experimental and most expensive project, entered by two Japanese architects, Kazuyo Sejima and Yuie Nishizawa. Both were trained by Toyo Ito and had worked together since 1995 in the Sanaa studio. Architects of one of the most singular works in contemporary architecture, they designed the Kanazawa 21st Century Museum of Contemporary Art, the Solverein School of Management and Design, and the New Museum of New York. At Lausanne, the programme was to be multiple and complex. It would have to house a large library, a gastronomic restaurant, an exhibition hall, administrative offices, a cafeteria, spaces for researchers to work, others for the students' associations, a bookshop, and a conference room. In the beginning, the architects stacked the various programmes to form a large tower. Thus empowered, the different areas were not conducive to exchanges between disciplines, nor to any collective life within the building. So the architects decided to forget the tower in favour of a horizontal layout that would cater for all functions.
We were born and grew up in Japan. In traditional houses, all the elements are linked in a natural way. When you open the sliding door that gives onto the garden, for example, there are always the eaves above the door that create a link with the garden. We grew up with this vision, the feeling of a natural continuity between the elements. But in Europe, to sum up construction methods, you start by cutting up the space to define it better, separate it to avoid ambiguity. There's a real difference in our conception of space.
In erecting the learning centre on one level, the architects straight away rid it of any spatial hierarchy. For them, the building should have neither up nor down, start nor finish. It should be the opposite of an ivory tower. Consequently, it has a gigantic footprint. It spreads over an area of more than 5 acres, the equivalent of 2 football pitches. Given the price of land in Switzerland, that puts some noses out of joint. But Sejima and Nishizawa do not lack audacity. They decided not to put the entrance on the facade. There are no openings, no door in the immense glass wall that forms a uniform belt round the building. So it is a raised volume on a single level. As a new centre of gravity for the campus, the building had to be accessible from all sides. The architects could have put the entrances at a variety of points on the quadrilateral, but they refused arbitrarily to put an entrance at any precise point that would be near to one function and distant from another. The principal access had to be in the centre and distribute each of the functions in an equal ratio. The only way of reaching the middle of this quadrilateral was to pass underneath it. Sanaa lifted the building from the ground in places to free 5 access points that converge on a common entrance. In this way, the architects removed any idea of a barrier between the exterior environment and the learning centre. The facades no longer put up a barrier, but invite the visitors to cross them in a constant flow, without going through a door or climbing up steps. There is a total porosity between the outside and the inside. Once passed through the facades, the visitor has the first experience of the place, discovering a traffic flow area that evokes both a large covered hall and a public square. That is the whole paradox of this place. The low vaults close the space, marking a territory while being wide open to the outside. An imposing ceiling with organic curves gives the visitor the impression of penetrating a cavern. In fact, they are walking under the building they want to enter, because this great concrete sail over their heads is precisely the foundation of the learning centre. The structure comprises a first concrete shell that reaches nearly 90 metres, and then a second that stretches more than 150 metres. These 2 shells rise at their highest point to at least 5 metres above the ground, a relationship between their reach and their height that was totally unusual. They were then connected by the flat parts on which they rested and pierced by 14 holes that outline interior courtyards. A forest of pillars extremely slender, 190 matchstick pillars, support a very light roof whose form completely matches the floor of the building. Floor and ceiling undulate in parallel to create the single volume of the learning centre.
These 2 mounds that are linked by flat floors give interior relief to the building. The various undulations made it possible for us to define areas and make them coexist side by side but distinct from each other. For example, you can be on the summit of a hill or on its slope, or on the flat part, and each time you're in a different world, but still be within the same space. Our building is simply one large room, open, provided with areas that are at once isolated, yet gently linked together.
Inside, there is a total inversion of values. The visitor discovers a completely different world, bathed in light, uncluttered, almost dematerialized. We are on the other side of the shell that models an astonishing artificial topography, composed of gently sloping hills and hollows. This is an unparalleled area in which the visitor meanders from one hillock to the next, goes down to a valley, makes his own path as through a park. And so that all can wander at will, the architects decided to free the space from all artificial barriers. In the 20,000 square metres of this single room, there is not a single wall, no doors and no corridors. Sanaa's learning centre is a huge, clear, undulating, continuous space where everything is in sight, everything is shared. The absence of walls in a multifunctional area is a real surprise. But the most audacious thing is the way that the architects thought to organise the space, Their answer is a simple idea. They decided to take advantage of the undulations to give spatial definition to the various zones of activity. They put the large library and the gastronomic restaurant on the top of the hills. The slopes accommodate the forum, an exhibition hall, and the workplaces. The reading room, bookshop, cafeteria, offices, bookstore and reception are all set down in the valleys. This open space organisation that is completely permeable perfectly embodies the concept of the Learning Center, where all barriers between disciplines and people have been totally suppressed. Students can attend a lecture, read, visit an exhibition, eat, relax, or make a noise as they pass from one hill to the next, from a plain to a hollow, all in the same yet ever-changing place.
一つはその直線っていうものをあんまり
For this project, we have not used the straight line, but rather freer forms. The hills, for example, are not regular, but undulating at random. In fact, you could say that the whole building is a great organic variation. We wanted to make a place that is similar to the way humans move about. People don't walk straight like that in linear fashion like a train. They move in curves, organically. Our architecture aims to be as near to human movement as possible.
Ambition is all very fine, but it was going to come up against certain difficulties, because arranging the programme on a surging floor is a real challenge, especially as there are practical constraints to some functions that are hardly compatible with a tilted floor. The main purpose of the Learning Center is for the library that has to accommodate 900 students. 900 seats arranged on a hilly terrain. A challenge that in no way put off the architects, who at first thought they would fix each piece of furniture, table and chair legs, wastepaper baskets and bookshelves, to the floor, adjusting the horizontality of each object according to the slope. But the clients feared that the library would see a constant chapter of accidents. So this idea of arrangement was quickly set aside. The solution finally adopted was inspired by the culture of rice on terrace landscapes. To solve the problem of horizontality, the architects simply added tiers of level platforms to the slopes, so that the students were now able to work without the risk of coming to grief. But the relation between the area occupied and the area of the floor is not really convincing. Fewer than 200 seats could be laid out on these hanging stages. For the gastronomic restaurant that too was perched on the top of a hill, the architects showed increased prudence. In order to guarantee safe customer service, they chose to cover the floor with a long rectangular slab that is perfectly horizontal. Elsewhere, the ups and downs of the floor are more easily suited to another function, because the forum fits naturally into the curve of one of the shells. Seating has been set on the slope of the load-bearing structure with the stage on the flat part. There is no need for artificial separation to define the space. The nature of the profile is sufficient to establish the function. What is most striking in this immense volume is the impression of emptiness. Everywhere the public wanders through empty space, devoid of equipment, non-functional in the classic meaning of the word. Sana'a terms these spaces as blanks, without signs, without qualification. This vacuity, this nothingness, is precisely what, for the architects, defines the space.
For us, it's not a question of empty space in the way Westerners see it. It's spaces that are an offer of exchange for people to meet people. Because in fact, the area offered to students are all too often predetermined. Architects always visualize their buildings in attributing a function to a space, such as corridors that are at first sight merely for moving around, or studies are for working in. But in reality, students take a nap in the studies and work and consult their teachers in the corridors. The function of a space is very often transformed by the way the students use it. We have taken that into account. According to us, it is for people to invent the use of an area. The more freedom they have, the more they use their imagination. More than one function might come to light.
The freedom given here to the end user to devote an undedicated space to a function is exceedingly generous. The proportion of untouched space represents more than half the built area, a commitment that is a radical break with the traditional codes of Western architecture. Space is defined, therefore, by its propensity to be taken in hand, transformed, reinvented by those who use it. At the Learning Center, the architects propose, the public dispose. With complete freedom, but not really just anywhere. It is around the light wells that polarize the space in which the students can gather to idle, doze, or work in direct contact with the outside. By erecting the Learning Center on a single level, the architects ran into the difficulty of doing it without light. How could they spread it abundantly in a volume hardly higher than 5 meters and with an area of more than 20,000 square meters? Sejima and Nishizawa elected to make 14 holes in the roof, all of different sizes and shapes. It then remained to provide the light wells with panels of curved glass. To ensure that they could follow the undulations of the roof and floor, they were modelled in 3D. Every pane of glass was cut separately to a unique shape and curve. Once assembled, they redrew the original shape of each of the patios. Seen from above, they give the impression that potato-shaped celestial objects have perforated the Learning Center. These zones open to the sky account for more than 20% of the built area, an empty-full ratio that is somewhat surprising in the conception of a roof. Above all, it was a fabulous technical challenge for the engineers. Since the preliminary design stage, many voices were raised to question the feasibility and most of all the solidity of such a structure. Nobody knew if it was at all possible. There was no standard form, no apparent method, no precedent to follow. Everything must be invented. The engineers had long known how to make thin reinforced concrete shells. They also knew that shells with holes don't hold together. They suggested to the architects that they should be strengthened with pillars. Sejima and Nishizawa categorically refused. Engineers across the whole world were asked to help resolve this problem, until one day one of them came to a meeting with a bow for a simple demonstration. To keep the bow bent, you need a string. For the bolts, they would use steel tension rods. Once the curve was adjusted, the rods would be embedded in concrete. The shells would be broken down into a series of arcs and laid next to each other. The solution appeared to be elementary, yet it was really very complicated and very difficult to implement. Because to pour, these low vaults required setting up a gigantic puzzle of 1,450 different-sized formwork tables, each with a unique geometry. Finally, a recipe for the concrete, still secret, had to be perfected, and the mixture had to be neither too compact nor too liquid, otherwise it would not spread to the base of the arches. It had to be poured in one go, continuously, for 48 hours. 2 concrete mixer plants were put to work, 300 men, day and night, in a never-ending ballet of mixer trucks. The result was amazing. It was the first time that such slightly rounded arches had been built without the need for anything to support them. Thousands of tons of concrete and steel that formed them seemed to spread without effort. The extraordinary complexity of the structure is indiscernible. Although the danger of a general collapse had been avoided, it had not entirely disappeared. A pillar had to be placed under one of the vaults. It is the only one for the whole of the surface of the Learning Center. The architects firmly contested its necessity and entered into a long battle with the engineers. But the latter won the contest. Since then, the pillar, which looks totally disproportional and rather lost, is known as the Pillar of Discord. By piercing the load-bearing structure, the architects have certainly lightened the load, but they have created above all as many interior courtyards in this huge concrete cavern. These 14 patios organize the area and constitute living space. Once again, it is the idea of the park as a public facility that is sought. The students take over each of these artificial clearings, constantly reinventing their use.
It has often been said that the Learning Center provides its users with great freedom, but in the end, all buildings have their share of freedom and constraint. Maybe here they are just of a different sort. One thing is sure, that we have not given freedom only to the public. They're all the same. Plenty of constraints. For example, they have to spend all their time climbing up the hills. There are no lifts, you know.
In fact, it all depends how you look at things. An architectural proposition can be seen by one person as a constraint and by another as freedom. Deep down, our architecture aims to put an end to this difference of perception.
But sometimes perceptions confront reality. An inquiry into the project by associations for the disabled deemed that difficulties with access to some areas is discriminatory. After several months of tense negotiations, the architects agreed to install funiculars on the steepest hills and imposing zigzag ramps, as found on mountain roads. It remained to succeed with the cohabitation of all sorts of activity without the noise of the cafeteria or the forum disturbing the concentration of the dear students. The architects created some private workplaces with astonishing glass bubbles that are reminders of the shape of the patios. These rooms maintain a dialogue with the main public spaces simply through their transparency. Sana'a wants this view to cross the building from one end to the other without ever coming up against any physical barrier. Not one. Further, there were very long debates about the necessity to close off Learning Center's 5,000 square meters of glass walls. The architects wanted neither curtains nor blinds. Knowing that the building has practically no windows, the sponsors feared that it would rapidly become a sauna in fine weather. Sana'a also fought hard to keep the concrete exposed. They wanted it to remain raw. But because of the obvious acoustical problems, they resolved to fit a carpet. The arguments as to which colour to choose were epic. Nobody agreed on the subtleties of cement grey. The colour was finally composed by Sana'a, pigment by pigment. These points of disagreement between contractor and client delayed delivery of the building by some months. But today, nobody minds. The dialectic of freedom and constraint gave way before the potency of the architecture of Sejima and Nishizawa. The building has become the campus totem. It is a real centre of social life, all the more remarkable because such success is rare. All too often, the grand plastic gestures by the architects fail to find their public. Even more so in that in this building, experimental in more ways than one, almost everything is novel. Its form, structure, conception of space, and the technical challenge facing its construction. Some months after its inauguration in 2010, Sejima and Nishizawa were presented with the world's highest prize for architecture, the Pritzker Prize.